everybody. It's 2 o'clock on a very rainy Wednesday in London here. But as far as in the middle of the screen for me, we have Fiona from Al Tamimi over in Dubai, and it's lovely and sunny for her. So isn't that nice? Sorry. We've got in my top right, we've got Eduardo Reyes, who's the features editor of the Law Society Gazette. In the bottom of the screen for me is Sean O'Grady, the associate editor of The Independent. To the left of me, we've got Joe Edwards, who's the head of family law and mediator for Forsters. The middle left, we have Kevin Poulter, employment partner over at Freeth. And middle right is Sharon Blackman, who's the managing director and GC over at City. So today we're talking about social media and reputation. So there's a lot obviously going on in social media at the moment. When we had our practice run a couple of days ago, I think we probably could have talked about what's happening on social media at the moment for a couple of hours alone. But I think what you're all hoping to get out of today really are some top tips and some really good discussion around social media, how it works, mistakes people have made, and what you can all do to build your brand on social media. So the first thing that I'm going to do is ask our lovely panel here what advice they would give. So I want them to talk about their own personal experience with social media. But I'm aware that a lot of people have pivoted the way that they use social media at the moment during the pandemic. And perhaps even more recently with a lot of worldwide events going on. So perhaps if I could ask each of the panel to talk very generally about how they build their brand on social media, what their experience of social media. Perhaps Joe, I could ask you first.
Yeah, of course. So I'm just thinking about this question before we started today, and really primarily I use Twitter, and those who follow me on Twitter see me tweeting quite a lot. I also use LinkedIn, Facebook a little bit as well. My journey started probably about 8 or so years ago. And at the time, looking back, I was just a fledgling mediator. And the main reason I started on social media was I wanted to increase the number of mediations I was doing and increase my profile. I then moved to, I became chair of our National Family Lawyers Organisation resolution in 2014. And I think looking back, the tone and the content of my tweets in particular became slightly different. The focus was different. And I was a lot more small c conservative, perhaps, in what I was saying, thinking about the audience that I was speaking to, but also the hat that I was wearing. And then latterly, I moved to Forsters just over 4 years ago now. And I think my focus changed again. I stepped down as resolution chair. I was heading up a team of my own for the first time. And it became much more a focus on communicating the sort of work that we were doing as a team, the sort of work we wanted to do, promoting successes that we had within the team, and just thinking about all of those different aspects. So it's been quite diverse, the journey that I've gone through. I'm sure, like everybody starting out in social media, I've made lots of mistakes along the way. And I think one of the best tips that I would give right up top is just to look at some people who are prolific on social media, look at what they do well, what can you learn from them, and think about the voice that you're speaking with, the audience that you're trying to target, and be gradual about it. It's something which it takes time to build up an audience, it takes time to build up a voice. So it's not something that can happen overnight. But with the right amount of effort, for me, it's been, I think, hugely successful and something which I genuinely enjoy doing.
Right, thanks, Joe. Ed, what about you?
Gosh, well, I think Joe made a very good point, which is the reason why on social media can evolve. I mean, for me, and I think probably for Sean as well, we're on from the very start on things like Twitter to spot news, to promote our own stuff, to interact with the people that we want to, forge a relationship with. There's an awful lot of lawyers who are a bit more active now who started off with something like Twitter as a way of kind of curating their own, newsfeed. They were essentially following channels and not really doing, very much themselves. But that's something which has in the parlance of the times, ramped up a bit during lockdown. To build it, I think once you've decided why you're on it and the kind of bits of your personality you're going to exhibit, I think you need authenticity. I think you need to be genuinely helpful, timely in what you're saying. But whereas we tend to think of the Twitter sphere as a fairly hostile place, I think actually for a lot of people, a top tip is to be supportive and affirming to your community and the people that you want to see thrive in the world, and be open to a few interactions, and not just think about yourself as this kind of broadcast channel. Don't just wait for your followers. Follow some people and then follow some people back, and be willing to retweet folk. It's not just about you. I think that's the big difference between perhaps just mainstream media and social media. You're not just pushing yourself out there. That's not the full power of what you're doing.
Yeah, and I guess that it brings it back to the answer really is in the name, isn't it? Social networking, social media. That actually it is there for. It's not just there to broadcast. It actually is there to social engagement, which means it's two-way. We actually had a question through Twitter earlier this morning from Bob Gregg, who is co-director at Only Mums and Dads, and he asked exactly that question because he deals with a lot of lawyers, which was, I find that a lot of lawyers broadcast. What can we do to get more lawyers engaged in conversations? So it's very interesting that you make that point, Ed. Sorry, Ed.
Sorry, just briefly on I think LinkedIn is relevant here as well. For a lot of lawyers, that's their safe space, but they're also linked to many more people than the 150 you're supposed to say yes to. So actually, we do see a lot of very good, useful, genuine interactions on LinkedIn, but it is a safer space, and I think lawyers like that too. Things get surprising amounts of traction on LinkedIn. It's not just this kind of big CV repository that I used to think of it as.
Yeah. Thanks, Ed. And if we can move to you, Fiona.
Yes. Look, I'm a veteran of LinkedIn. I've been on for a long time, and it's my favourite social media. Finding my voice on LinkedIn took a little while, and I always say to the young lawyers, make sure you find your voice as early as possible, and the voice has to be for your clients. I see a lot of lawyers on there trying to impress other lawyers, and to be honest, that's not what that's for. It's really for your clients. It's about engaging with your clients and making your clients understand where you sit and how you can be helpful to them. I use a lot of humour in my LinkedIn. If anyone's seen my posts, often they have nothing to do with law whatsoever. This week I was talking about how awful it is when you change your password and still can't get into a site. I've got 5,000 views on that post, and it's, sometimes I think particularly at the moment, people are looking for a distraction, but weirdly, even though I don't always talk about law, I get an awful lot of clients through LinkedIn. I do a lot of work on Facebook groups as well, and I quite like those. So again, the industry focused groups, and I tend to drop little pearls of wisdom for people. So that's just about helping the community more than anything. Obviously, you don't generally get clients from that, but that's about profile for me. I'm not brave enough for Twitter just yet. I find Twitter a little bit scary, a little bit fast, and a little bit opinionated. So I'm not quite brave enough for that. But we are considering Instagram at the moment as a new outlet. Because I'm a media lawyer, most of my clients are in media, they're all on Instagram. So we're thinking of moving into that space. And again, trying to work out what voice we're going to use there. It'll be different to my LinkedIn voice because it's going to be much more of a corporate site. But I'm quite excited about that. I think it's going to be a great move.
Brilliant, thank you, thanks Fiona. And Sean, obviously, as the associate editor of the Independent, we'd very much expect to see you on social media. So what's your chosen platform?
Well, that would be Twitter, yes, which I use much more than I used to. Not to build my own brand, which would probably be futile, but just to amplify and echo what the Independent does, because we're very fortunate. We've got an excellent audience team, and they pump out everything into social media that they think is worth doing at any rate. And I'm happy to rely on them for the publicity for most of the things that I write. But I retweet my own stuff and I comment occasionally. I do retweet lots of other things. And I quite enjoy it. And so far, nobody's blocked me, which is a slight disappointment. I mean, I have been attacked and piled on, but not very often. Not as often as I would like. And only the odd death threat.
Oh, well, you haven't made it till you've had at least 5, apparently, Sean.
That is my view. And I don't know how they carry out any such threat, but there we are. But that's the way I see it. So I think that I'm also very, because if you're in my line of work, you're very much associated with the independent brand, in the brand of the employer. I suppose that's true of a lot of legal people too. But you have to be also careful about what you do, joking apart. So you can't really wind people up and put stuff out that's illegal or abusive. Not that I'd be inclined to, but that's something you have to watch as well. You've got to watch your own reputation, but you've also got to watch the reputation of your brand. And I think we'll talk about that some more. So, but I do enjoy Twitter. I enjoy following the thing. I don't, however, rely on it for my news. I think that's a dangerous thing to do.
Yeah. And Sharon, what about you? Coming at it from a GC point of view, managing director, what's your chosen platform?
Well, typically you'll find me on LinkedIn. I'm not the one to be posting lots of things. I'm very interested in what other people are doing, and I think it's a nice way to stay in touch with people. Latterly, I've been introduced to both Twitter and Instagram, but most of that has been around my, I'm going to say extracurricular, but it's not really, but the pro bono activity that I'm involved in, and ensuring that we can get the message out around pro bono. It's been useful to use those avenues, and I think it's been a bit of an eye-opener to me as to how many people are actually on them and doing things, because prior to perhaps this year, I wasn't at all on Instagram, and very, very limited presence on Twitter.
Sure, thank you, Sharon. And just before we move to Kevin, I should have said at the beginning, there is a raise hand function, but unfortunately, because of the fact that you're all muted, you can't actually ask a question, but you can type a question. So please, throughout the next 75 minutes, if you can type some questions, we are going to make this interactive. So I actually will come to those questions when I can. So if you can type some questions, as I said, I'll come to those as we go along. And here's Kevin. Poor old Kevin's feeling slightly picked on because he was the only one here who I looked at the background and asked him to remove something. So Kevin's feeling a bit sensitive, but we won't say what it was, Kevin.
Okay. I'm worried for my own reputation now. Please don't share on social media. I think I've come at this from a number of different angles. Partially, so I started with social media very much from a personal point of view, through Facebook, as most people will have done, pretty much when it first came around, and similar with Twitter. And over time, it's kind of infiltrated more of my work life. And inevitably, as an employment lawyer, I'm getting inquiries around the employment aspects of social media as well, and in terms of reputation, of course, but also the impact on employers and how that can be regulated, how that can be managed in a different way. So I look at it through a different set of lenses. But in the same way, I think, like people have already said, they use, I think, different things, different platforms for different reasons. And certainly I would tend to say that my Instagram is certainly more personal to me. LinkedIn, obviously, the more sort of business-minded side of things, and Twitter probably straddling the two. But I also use it increasingly for information, and maybe not for mainstream news, but certainly for sector-specific news. And one of the great things, particularly around Twitter, is the community of employment lawyers that's on there, and lawyers generally, I would say, but specifically, in my experience, employment lawyers who do share information, who do share knowledge, and particularly during this pandemic, maybe the relaxed approach that the government's taken to setting clear guidance out for us has absolutely been essential for us to work together and to collaborate, whether we know it or not, just to consume this information, to share this information, and to really get a grip of what's going on, so we can then pass that on to the benefit of our clients and colleagues. So for me, it's been invaluable during this period. And certainly the news tends to appear on social media before it does appear, either in this case on the government's website or in the press.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you all for those introductions. And I think what really came out of that was, it's when you think about the channels that you want to use on social media, it really is to suit your personality. So your personality IRL in real life should be the same personality that you have on social media, and that will suit different platforms. If you use the example of Beyonce has millions of followers on Twitter, yet she doesn't use her Twitter account because she feels that Instagram is where she can be herself. She uses photographs. So despite having a channel that has a lot of followers waiting for her to say something, she doesn't use it. And I think that's a really good point for the participants who are listening, thinking perhaps I want to do more on social media, or I haven't done that much. How can I do that? Is actually to choose a platform that you feel very comfortable with. And the second thing I think is that Fiona made a very good point there when she talked about Twitter and said that it's a little bit scary. It can be a little bit aggressive. And I think particularly in the last 4 to 6 weeks, I think that the panel would agree. We've seen a bit of a shift, a bit of a change. Sean mentioned pylons, and Sean really wants a pylon. So if anybody would love to pile to one of Sean's tweets, please do, because he's waiting for that. But I think the point is that a lot more people are expressing their opinions. People are at home. There's perhaps not enough guidance. There hasn't been enough training. And people are wide open. They're going on there, they're putting their opinions out, and there will often be a pile-on. And I think predominantly that happens on Twitter more than it happens on LinkedIn, although I did see at the weekend an example of this on LinkedIn, and I am starting to see that more on LinkedIn as well. So I guess what I would ask is, have you changed the way in which you're using social media within the last couple of months? Are you feeling any more nervous about it at all? Have you changed anything, or actually are you continuing as you were before? And perhaps if I can ask Ed, if I could ask you, are you doing anything different?
I think not so much in the last few months, although I've had probably interactions with people I wouldn't have had, before, because you said have time on their hands. Going back a bit, I had the experience of writing about some areas which attracted, a lot of kind of hate tweets and things. I think I was writing about some equality and diversity issues, about Northern Ireland, about Brexit, and I had people tweeting at me with the bloodied hand of Ulster as their profile pic, and I had quite a troll at the same time, who was a special guy. He was he'd done contract work for MI6. He lived in Australia. He'd spent time in prison, and had some thoroughly nasty accusations, against me. And at that point, actually, based on that, I actually shared a bit more of myself on Twitter. I thought, these people being so horrible to me, do not know there's someone at the other end. So I started tweeting the odd watercolor sketch, or a bit more about wildlife, whilst protecting family privacy. I just thought, maybe we should see each other in the round a bit more, rather than some kind of shouty pastiche. By and large, I feel that's worked for my experience on social media, even extending to sharing a bit about my disabled daughter when I've been fundraising and so on. I've written some things about that, and it might be coincidental or not, but I've got a lot less shit directed at me over social media in the current environment than I was back then. So that it feels like that was a good thing to do.
Yeah.
Just being a bit more human,
yeah.
Or occasionally, rather than just raging back at people, just reminding them that You know, there's people at the other end of these tweets you're sending.
And we,
So,
we
yeah,
in fact
just
we have
carrying
a,
on.
yeah, we have a poll on that coming up shortly around social media and kindness, actually, asking whether we think people generally act with kindness on social media. And the reason for that was we were having a discussion in our prep around the fact that perhaps a lot of people have forgotten that at the end of a social media account usually is a person. So when people do decide to have a pile on or you know, say something unkind, that actually, you know, that's a person at the end of it. And obviously during lockdown, mental health is a really important issue. So I guess what I would ask is, and I'll particularly ask this to the lawyers on the panel, is, you know, what kind of support is on offer? I'm thinking training, I'm thinking any kind of support, because if you're expected to use social media as a business development tool, then you know, how should you be expected to do that? And particularly in a world that we live in at the moment, where, you know, there are pylons, you could say something which actually is taken the wrong way. People are showing a lot more of themselves because they're at home. Vulnerability is kind of the buzzword, but again, how do you protect yourself while at the same time being vulnerable? So I'd be quite interested to hear from the three lawyers, and then I'd also be interested to hear from you, Fiona, as a GC in a company and a managing director, about how you might be actually supporting your teams. So if Joe, if I could go to you first.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think I've been quite fortunate in the support that I've had around social media. So although I haven't ever, I don't think, formally had training around it, I have to give a shout out to Forster's BD team, who are fantastic, and Martin Morris in particular, who is very supportive around any BD and social media initiatives. But also there's a lot of stuff out there that you can read and gen up on. So I was reminding myself this morning, Resolution, the Family Lawyers Organisation, published about a year ago a guide to good practice on using social media with some really good tips in there. The Law Society put the guidance note out, Ed will correct me, I think it was last December, so fairly recently. So there are a lot of tips that are available, and it's really important, obviously, rightly, solicitors have regulatory considerations, the SRA to think about. So you need to be very aware of the fact that, you know, our integrity is a paramount part of our job, and in social media, as we've said already, these messages are coming out very quickly, sometimes without any filter. So it's super important, even if you've not been formally trained, to be aware of the very many resources that there are, but also to be aware of the regulatory aspects and all of those considerations when you are engaging in social media exchanges with people or putting your own views out there.
And actually, before we move on to Kevin to answer, I'm going to upload a poll. And if any of you were on our Meet the Media webinar in March, you'll know that I killed the poll. So this time I'm going to be a little bit more patient. I'm going to upload the poll. And the poll question is, have you had any training on social media in the last 6 months? Okay. I'm going to launch the poll now. I think everyone should have had time to answer.
Oh gosh, here we go.
Okay, so numbers are in. Yes, 34%, no, 64%, and I don't need any, 4%. So I'm going to end the poll now. So I'll go to you, Kevin, as an employment lawyer, because, oh, sorry, let me close that. Because I suppose as an employment lawyer, are you seeing people actually losing their jobs, perhaps for opinions or for activity on social media? And so are you surprised to see that actually the majority there, 60%, haven't actually had any training or support when it comes to social media?
Am I surprised by that? I'm not surprised by that. I think that particularly lawyers, and law firms, they're very good at sort of setting down rules and regulations, as we know, and yet the SRA is taking a more light touch to what these regulations are, and sort of values driven. And I know there's a big push towards values in many organizations now. And the social media doesn't always follow that. The rules don't always follow that drive. And at the end of the day, we've got to remember that people are people. We're all individuals. And I've even seen something on social media this morning, really trying to encourage so there's more tolerance around mistakes for lawyers, and this applies also to social media to a degree. And of course, there are definite no-goes, confidentiality, client information, of course, data protection issues. But at the same time, it is easy to make mistakes. It's easy, whilst we're doing a Zoom call, to have somebody walking around the pastors at the back, not protecting our screens when we're on working from home or in a shared house, or even when we're commuting. So all these things need to sort of be measured. And it's right to have guidance around these things, to have some rules. But increasingly, and I think this is particularly during lockdown, as our opportunities to network in real life have been massively reduced, we're encouraged, and certainly Freeth has encouraged people to use social media platforms to reach out, whether that's through LinkedIn or through Twitter, or indeed through Zoom, other sort of instant chats, live chat rooms, which is in its essence another form of social media, where we don't really know who's watching. We don't necessarily have an idea of whether things are being recorded or not. Where these messages are being taken and shared beyond this immediate interaction. So we've got to take these things into account, but a lighter touch approach, a more encouraging approach by firms to have their employees and their lawyers to use social media, I think is a better way of going, whilst also recognizing that there are parameters, there are no-go areas, and to train and to advise around those, rather than simply sort of give somebody a policy as soon as they start their job, then lock it away in a vault until they do something wrong, then you pull it out and sort of hit them around the head with it, metaphorically. So then that happens an awful lot, and this is what I see frequently in my job, that an employee will do something which is possibly relatively sort of unimportant in the scheme of things. It might be a specific breach of a policy, but what's the harm? And I think we've often got to come down to, well, what's the harm? How closely aligned, and I've heard people talking already about sort of that brand image and how closely aligned people are with the people who they work for, with the organizations. And on the one hand, we're all being encouraged to use social media to build up our professional networks, but those professional networks want to be owned by our employers. Well, are we acting through ourselves? Are we acting for our employer? Who owns that information? Who owns those contacts? Well, of course, they're personal, usually. There might be other policies, there might be contracts in place which say to the contrary, but it's the person that people invest in, who clients invest in, more frequently now, I think, than ever, than it is the name of the firm who that person works for. So taking that into account, thinking about those things, thinking about how that works is essential, but giving guidance and training and support to people who are on the front line, I think is essential.
Yeah, and actually, Fiona, before and what you've just mentioned there, Kevin, around policies, we have a question here from Constance Whitman, who actually asks, do any of you have formal written policies relating to social media? So perhaps Fiona, and obviously it's slightly different for you being based out in the Middle East, because actually making a mistake on social media, there's a much harsher punishment, which I'm sure you can tell us about. But tell us, do you have a policy in place?
We do have a policy. Probably needs a refresh. I think it's probably time, and we do draft a lot of them within our team, because obviously it falls under the media law specialisation. So we do draft a lot for media companies. What I find interesting is the media policies the social media policies I'm asked to draft are for companies that already work in media, and you would think that they're the people who would know more than any what you can and cannot say in any media, because they're creating media themselves. We're not seeing them for things like banks, insurance companies, those kind of companies aren't coming us and requesting policies, which I find interesting, particularly given the environment we work in here. Because, you know, in the UAE, a lot of these activities are actually criminal in nature. So defamation, for example, if you defame somebody in a social media post, you are liable criminally. There's fines and jail and possible deportation if you're not a national. Now, they're very serious ramifications for anybody. So I think for a company to have a policy and to train its people to ensure that they don't bring their home values into the environment where they're going to fall foul of the law and in a big way, I would have thought that would be important. So we're not seeing as much of that as I would expect. I think the other thing to keep in mind, though, is that there's a lot of talk about what you can and can't do in social media here. And so most people have heard the chatter in their Facebooks, you know, the mums groups on Facebook are always chatting about, you know, you can do this, you can't do that, don't do this, don't do that. In a sense, there's a lot more drama around what people think the law is than what the law actually is. So there's a lot of over-censorship that we see as well. But it is a point of much discussion with everybody, because, you know, it's quite restricting.
And Sharon, from the point of view as a GC and managing director over at City, what's your feel on policies and actually supporting staff?
Well, we've always had a corporate communications team, and so clearly they've evolved into the space of kind of managing those kind of communications out when it's about the company itself. We do have some internal guidance and policies around use of social media in the context of reaching out to clients, etc. And that's available to our businesses. But in terms of the legal function, I think the biggest communication that we make out is around ensuring that, I guess it's warning people about how their personal life, and that's everything, because it also includes, you know, if you go down to the pub and do something and people know and you've got a City t-shirt on or something. So it's the whole span of that. But we do remind people that obviously spills over into social media, where people often let their guard down or are more personal, and it is more personal because it is about them. I think it is incumbent upon us to tell people that you need to be mindful that, you know, even when you're off the clock, to a point, yeah, you do represent the City brand. So I think in terms of policies, more around usage in a commercial sense, so how we would use it or how we expect people to use it to further the City brand, but also reminders really about the care that people should take. And obviously we've got strong values, and we put out a lot of information around the culture that we expect to have from our employees. And so we hope that that also informs what people say both in the office and outside the office, at least to an extent.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this comes back to what we talked about right at the beginning, which is around kindness, and actually those values and the way that you operate on social media. I think if kindness is a main value element, then actually usually you'd hope that you wouldn't go far wrong. For example, if you saw something and you thought, actually that's not correct, you know, there's two ways of doing it. You can either email that person directly and say, I just saw your tweet or your LinkedIn post, you know, I think you might have this wrong, you know, you might want to think about something. Or of course you can choose that actually you might want to publicly shame them, tell them that they've done something wrong, get a bit of a pile on going, and then hope that actually you'd get something changed there. So there is a lot of different ways. And of course, obviously, you know, coming back to Sean and Ed, you know, if everybody did do that and everybody just emailed everybody and said, oh, I think you've made a mistake, do you want to correct it? Obviously, you know, we wouldn't have as much news. Social media wouldn't have perhaps the energy that it does. So I guess I'd ask around the media on social media, and looking at the Leveson report, which pointed to, I think, one paragraph which gave information about the internet, and within that paragraph mentioned social media. So as far as guidance goes for the media and how they're broadcasting on social media, because we often You know, we do see some quite harsh views, and not from yourselves, obviously, but from other journalists on social media. I mean, do you think, I guess, that there's enough guidance around there? Do you think that there needs to be tighter restrictions on journalists and what they're able to post on social media?
Well, I think it's a bit like lockdown, or what some people say about lockdown and social distancing and all that, which is that you have to use your common sense. That's a very important commodity in this framework. And there isn't very much to go on, as far as I know, at any rate. And for most of the time, most of the writers on any given title, print or web or whatever, they'll be tweeting stuff and reacting in a way that's consistent with their brand's values and not wildly inconsistent with them. At least you'd hope that way, even if they get into spats with people, which is perfectly normal, really. And even if they're quite heated, which is perfectly normal. I mean, if you want to have an argument with Donald Trump, if you're lucky enough to have an argument with Donald Trump on Twitter, fine. I think that would be okay. That wouldn't be something anyone would necessarily condemn. The problem obviously comes when people get overexcited, and it's nothing special about social media. It's like having an argument in a pub or on the television studio with somebody. And if you act in any way that's brings your organization into disrepute, then even though they are views my own, or these are my own views, or nobody else's, or I'm a free thinker, or whatever you put on your Twitter feed or anywhere else, that's not necessarily a very good legal defense, and it's not necessarily a very good sort of moral defense either, because you are behaving in a way that isn't really very helpful to your employers or possibly yourself. So I would say that, and I think that, as I say, I think there's a clause in our contracts, employment contracts, that says that you don't bring the firm into disrepute, which I don't think is unusual. I don't think is unreasonable either. And I think there's a little bit in the code of conduct that we run about the use of social media. But it is a sort of grey area about who's speaking for who. And vice versa. I mean, if we put if the Independent puts a tweet out with a column, which is particularly offensive, well, is it the writer who's responsible for that, or is it the Independent, or is it both? And especially now you've got, as we saw with the controversy of the New York Times lately, there's a lot more sort of what's the word? Sort of I'm trying to think of the word, not conflict. There's a lot of sort of tension between woke values, which are the modern ones for the under 40s, I believe, and liberal values, which are the traditional ones, at least as far as we're concerned, which tend to be favoured by the over 40s. And there is a slight clash there about what you actually should and shouldn't say, and what your company should and shouldn't say in the way of tweets. In other words, what you should and shouldn't publish, and what actually does constitute bringing your brand into disrepute. If you start to have an argument with somebody on sort of woke values, like the J.K. Rowling stuff, or the stuff about Trump sending in the troops against the demonstrators and that sort of thing, is that actually something that represents your values or your employer's values or your brand's values, or is that something that you should just live and let live? And that's not very clear. And okay, you can try and use common sense there, but it's very uncharted and a bit dangerous.
But similar to how as a newspaper you have readers, an audience that you need to also take into consideration when you're considering what values to promote and which values to maybe put to one side. I think for lawyers, we also not only have our employers to think about, ourselves, our own views to think about, but also clients, and potentially either upsetting clients, putting ourselves in a position where they will no longer want to instruct us, saying something which contradicts their own values, and they may be extreme values or extreme views. We've also got to consider that sort of middle road in many ways, and separate out our own personal views from those that maybe we are we want others to perceive that we may have, or to know that we have. So I think we're in a really difficult position, particularly as lawyers, but also as journalists, like you, Sean.
Yeah, I think that's a really good time actually to come to a couple of polls. I'm going to do one after the other. The first one is, hang on a minute, I've shared, okay, stop sharing results. Okay, so I'm now going to go to poll 2, and as you can see, talk amongst yourselves because I'm failing here to find poll number 2. Oh no, I've done it. It's okay, everybody. So here we go. Poll number 2, social media and kindness. Do you think people generally act with kindness on social media?
No, I think this does depend on the platform as well.
Yeah, I would agree. Yes.
Okay, so we've got there. We've got 23% yes, 25% no, and 60% sometimes. So actually, you know, that's a majority basically saying either no or only sometimes. Are the panel surprised about that?
I mean, I was going to say, Melissa, I wonder whether, although it's predominantly no's, whether the no's would have been greater in number pre-COVID, pre-lockdown, because maybe I'm being too optimistic, and I agree with what Kevin says about it very much depends on the platform as well. But I said at the start, Twitter is really my hunting ground, is where I spend most of my time, my social media time. And I do feel there has been a distinct shift since the 23rd of March and since we went into lockdown. And I personally, although we've all spoken of the odd spat that we've seen, I've seen a lot of kindness, and a lot of the focus has shifted to right at the start. People, I think lawyers were supporting each other. You know, there's a lot of guidance all coming out in very short measure when we first went into lockdown about how the courts are operating, for example. Lots of clients needing guidance. So not for me, it was parents who didn't know what lockdown meant for child arrangements. It was people who could no longer afford to pay spousal maintenance, for example. So all of those things I've seen cropping up more and more on Twitter, and people having that level of interaction, having that level of support. And actually, some people, in certain instances, really wearing their heart on their sleeves and saying, you know, lawyers or anybody saying on the odd day, I'm having a really bad day, I'm really struggling today. And lots of people just wading in and trying to support them. So maybe I'm being naive to say, I hope that this is right and that this will persist. But we're all talking about how this period has affected us and changes we might make in the longer term. And if there is an outbreak of longer term kindness on Twitter, on other social media platforms, I mean, that can obviously only be a good thing. So I do personally think that if you had done that poll, even only a few months ago, the answers may have been more extreme, but it may be that other panelists or others using different platforms disagree with that.
I think I'm going to jump into the next poll, which is so when you see views of my own, do you separate that view from the view of the organisation that the individual works at? Now, this is interesting. I wasn't expecting this answer. So we have, okay, I'm going to end the poll. I think we've mostly got people in there. So the results we've got there, yes, majority, 37%, do separate the view of the organisation from the individual. 31% said no, 33% sat on the fence and said maybe. So I'm surprised at that, because my take as somebody who looks after reputation is that using up views of my own on your Twitter account is a waste of characters, because actually you're still associated with that organization, even if you don't have the name of the organization on there. If you say something that is actually going to cause a lot of contention, a lot of disruption, then actually that could come back. And obviously Kevin's going to know more about this than others. And I think, the news that came out today around Facebook, saying that Nick Clegg said basically that Facebook are going to put much more stricter measures down for anything to do with elections. Obviously, seeing that they've taken the view that perhaps people had perceived that before. Looking at Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump, when he's tweeting, he's obviously tweeting his individual thoughts, but actually, how does that impact on the US government? So personally, that would be my opinion. But can somebody on the panel who has the opposite opinion and thinks that actually views are my own does mean views are my own, and it isn't actually reflected towards the organisation? Do we have anyone on the panel who has that view? So that's I think interesting in itself. And what I'm also going to do is, I can see we have 23 questions. The webinar does run for 75 minutes, which is another 30 minutes. I'm just going to have a quick scroll through. We have one here from Keith Oliver over at Peters and Peters. He asks, do any of you think that the term fake news could not or would not exist, even as a concept, were it not for social media and the ability to misinform? And what do we think of Marcus Rashford's ability through social media to have changed government policy in 24 hours? So how about Eduardo? Why don't we take you first on this one?
Yeah, I mean, our own media has always been quite raucous. I think there's plenty of misinformation, subtly done, but misinformation that gets, pushed out there. I guess it's the sheer volume of what's being shared of dubious content. And you were asking earlier about what we, would or wouldn't share. I actually always do due diligence on something I'm sharing. If it's a piece of information, if it's an article, I will go to the website and actually read it to check what I'm sharing. There are people out there with huge followings who I think probably don't apply those standards, but who have become channels. That said, I still think when people are linking to a story by our publication, The Independent, BBC, they do have an expectation that there has been some checking done there. But yeah, it's the sheer, and it's the way in which social media allows us to segment off into different groups as well. We talk about the interactions, but an awful lot of this is people just circling the wagons and listening to people agree with them in their own echo chamber. That's not particularly new, but I think the intensity is. The Free School Meals issue, the ability to just talk direct to the Prime Minister, to the government, using your own platform like that is new. It would take probably previously a campaign of months by Esther Rantzen broadcasting things and doing interviews with serious newspapers to get changes like that and a U-turn. But he's done it in days, not least because of his backstory, and that's a backstory that the media's helped, amplify the fact that he relied on free school meals. That's in some ways that's a classic power of the media story alongside this social media story that's there.
And I think as well, that comes back to as well the power of brand, the power of followers on social media, because something I'd read was that actually a week before, some children's charities had actually written to the government saying that they needed to make a U-turn on this, that it wasn't right. But obviously when the publicity comes to a footballer, somebody with a much bigger presence on social media. So perhaps there's something in it that actually that the voices that are taken are actually the voices that have the bigger brands, the bigger following on social media. We've still got 23 questions. So I'm just going to, somebody's asked, what is your take on using Instagram for business, particularly for professional services? Now I'm going to take this to Fiona, because Fiona, you mentioned actually
Yes.
that you're considering Instagram. So could you tell us why?
Because that's where my clients are. And I think, Instagram is a really fabulous tool for people to remember you by, because it's visual. So if I just put out a top tip for a media lawyer on LinkedIn, it won't be remembered as much as if I link it to a photograph of something that's cool or memorable. So we're using Instagram. We're planning on, you haven't started yet, in that way. So we're going to be doing some little tips for people who are in the industry and then using the photo. And for me, it's just about memorability. And again, we haven't found our voice, and I think we have to work on that.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Somebody's asked, in your experience, what is one of the worst mistakes a law firm could make when posting on LinkedIn? Who would like to take this one? Kevin looks like he's eager to give an answer.
I don't think it's necessarily specific to LinkedIn, but any law firm that picks a fight is itself, whoever it might be with, I think is always going to be a difficult battle to win. Very public battles, generally conflicts, are never a good idea. And just to slightly spin on its head for a second, people have probably seen over the Black Lives Matters, the tea companies, and I think it started off with Yorkshire Tea being praised for not taking a stance on the BLM. Now, immediately, and they hadn't made a statement, it seems, and this is sort of the responsibility that brands and firms do have. It hadn't made a statement, and that was perceived that it didn't agree with the principles behind the protests. And actually, they stepped up and they said, "No, actually, we do agree with it. We're just been sort of educating ourselves, getting our own information together." And then they made the statement. And by doing that, they didn't just take themselves with it. They said they took PG Tips, I think, were the first ones to join them, Twinings, blah, blah, Tetley's, everybody joined in. And it became it became a big media story to start with. But it was about solidarity. And I think that's a great social media story. Now, the opposite could have been true. The other tea brands could have sort of gathered together and stayed out of it, let Yorkshire Tea take the fall. This is the same with law firms in many ways. That if we act collectively, if we stand together on these points and support one another, far better than sort of sending people to the wolves, because it impacts on the profession. And one of the responsibilities that we do have as lawyers is to act in the best interest of the profession as well, and to maintain those standards. So I think law firms need to bear that in mind. I'm not suggesting that anyone particularly does, but I've seen law firms celebrating themselves for great successes that they've had. And congratulations, well done, fine. Self-promotion is another one, and I don't know if anybody else, and again, fantastic for all these people that are making it into the sort of top tiers of the directories. But for 1 week of the year, this is all that the news stories are, and I don't think anybody outside of those firms or those people, again, well done, actually cares. And that, I think, does resonate with people over time. So anything that's too self-congratulatory or too seeking out conflict would be a no-no for me.
Can I briefly add, Melissa, to what Kevin was saying? The other thing that I've seen that rightly journalists, I think, are starting to call lawyers out on is preying on what I call preying on human misery. Yeah. So at the start of the COVID lockdown, for example, there were too many in my industry in family law who were tweeting, saying, "Oh, you know, we're going to be overrun with work once this is all over," or encouraging businessmen to go for divorces while their assets were at a low value. Yeah. And that sort of thing, rightly, journalists, even before this happened, were saying, whatever you do, family lawyers, do not be sending me press releases along those lines. And then they started happening. So just be aware of the environment in which you're operating, and don't seek to prey on human misery. Like the rush every January, again, in my industry, to celebrate the fact that loads of people might be rushing to get divorced on a certain day of the year. It's not a very attractive look, so not something to put out there on social media.
No, and I think on our, hopefully everyone in the audience has downloaded a copy of our social media during COVID-19 guide. There is a really good sensitivity checklist on page 8. And one of the things in there is, does your content add value during the crisis? And I think that's a really good thing to remember. Within the paper also, Ed, we have a quote from you talking about the fact that everything's in the public domain, which is a huge contribution to accountability. Tone of voice, showing the human face are important. But there's a lot of bad examples, lapsing into insults, coming across as pompous, high-handed, uncaring, and boasting. So I think we're all probably in agreement that actually boasting, particularly during a time of a pandemic, is pretty much a no-no. So I'm going to just pop to the questions again because we have lots. Somebody's asked, Dan Jones has asked, would the panel say the purpose of Twitter has evolved or changed? Sean, you're nodding your head.
Yes, is the answer to that. I think that years and years ago, 10 years ago or so, if anyone can remember, I mean, it's not been going that long. I think it was genuinely more social than media, if you like. It was about sort of harmless, gossipy stuff, domestic stuff. And now you get fascism everywhere and racism and God only knows what out there. And obviously it has evolved and it will evolve some more. And it's found its own way of, to some extent, regulating itself from the bots. People know that what kind of stuff is probably bogus. They know what sort of stuff might be fake. They know, or they just about understand what is a parody account, not always, which gives amusement to the people doing the parody accounts, and that sort of thing. And it's sort of evolving in a sort of Wild West way, in an unregulated way, and as I say, in a sort of self-regulated way by the users, as I believe the House of Lords used to manage itself without a speaker. So that's pretty encouraging in a way, even though it's just a sort of bear pit for a lot of the time. There's still a lot of fun, amusing, harmless, heartwarming stuff on there as well. So it certainly is amusing. I think that, as I was saying before, the sort of corporate policies and things like law firms' attitudes, as you say, and the legal framework generally hasn't caught up with the speed of evolution, which is certainly there. And it is a spreader of fake news in a way that we haven't had before, because it's so fast and it's so global.
Yeah. And we've got another question here, anonymous question. In the context of a company's social media account, not an individual, how would you suggest an organization made up of lots of individuals with lots of different beliefs and values should express opinions and engage further on social media beyond standard postings and still project a clear voice? I think this comes back to what we were talking about before, about having opinions. So I think Sharon, as over a GC over at City with a lot of employees over there, how do you manage that with a lot of people with different opinions, actively using social media? And I think as we had before, none of us on the panel really believe that when you put up, these are my own views, it actually really means anything. So how does a company cope with that, I guess?
I think we do a lot of training around, we have a code of conduct, and it's not just, as I said before, covering what people do in terms of social media. It talks about the image, what City stands for, what we believe we stand for, the commitment we have to our clients and the communities that we work in, and is very clear about the expectations that we have generally for employees in furthering those commitments and the conduct that we expect. And I think it's really a combination between that. We do annual training. We try and I think we do encourage people to have a personal voice if they want to use social media. But I don't know that we necessarily, as a firm, would go as far as to say that we encourage individuals to use social media. We definitely leave it up to them. But we do have a corporate account. And that is definitely geared towards the corporate message. So it is grounded in our values, it's grounded in our code of conduct, it's grounded in what our expectations are in terms of the firm. And I guess a lot of positivity in that, in terms of the positive messages about City are going out there.
Yeah, I'm scrolling through the questions actually, and a lot of these questions are coming up around policies and what we suggest goes into a policy, how many people have policies. And actually that's very good timing, because our last poll, if I can open it, actually asks, do you know what's in your company's social media policy? The answer being yes, no, or you don't care.
This is anonymous. Checking.
It is anonymous, everybody, I should say, yes.
I think just one thing to add to Sharon's point whilst we're just waiting for the results to come in, that I think that what law firms can do and what any company can do, it's difficult to speak as one voice, I think, for the collective. And that's always going to be a difficult challenge. And this is why sort of brand specialists are required. But what it can do is to give a voice or a greater platform to the employees that it has within its organization. So to share their stories, to bring them in, which reflect those values, which kind of support or underpin those values, but to I think trust in its employees, trust in its lawyers to live by them, and again, berate them when they've got it wrong, and obviously don't promote that, but to actually celebrate those people. And I think during particularly the moment, like Pride Month has been one of those times when I've seen law firms doing great work about celebrating their LGBT plus employees, to share their stories, to use them in many ways to deliver those values. So I think that's another way of doing it.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point, actually, Kevin. That I think, and I think a lot of this comes back to culture, and I think it comes back to company culture and values. That actually, if the companies are very, very clear and the leadership is very, very clear on what the culture is, what the values are, I think actually people will be more open, people will be kinder, people actually will stick to a social media policy whilst having their own opinions. And I do think for law firms, looking at that culture piece and values and purpose is probably the next step after lockdown.
And I think what doesn't always, sorry, just to jump in again, but what doesn't always follow through is that whoever's running the social media for those companies, there is no strategy. There isn't necessarily any guidelines in place for those tools that are being used. And I often, there's usually a division between the lawyers within the firm and the people who are running those accounts. And I think that again is that division, that divide is sometimes quite difficult to bridge unless you have an integrated strategy.
Yeah. And we have here, we've had 88 people out of this, quite a lot more participants than that, but 88 people did answer this. And of that, 40% said no, they did not know what was in their company social media policy. I guess what would be more telling would actually be whether they then actually use social media. And I'm going to presume that they do because of the fact that they're on this webinar. So that's I think that's an interesting point. And then we keep coming back to that. We keep coming back to the support that I think there's an expectation within the sector, particularly for BD, that people should be promoting themselves. They should be building their brand. Everything's about relationships. We talked about, that the clue was in the word social engagement, that actually people are expected to do it. But what it feels like is coming through here is that actually there isn't the support to enable people to do it and not feel scared, I guess, about making a mistake. Ed, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to share that one of my favourite tweets of this entire period came from an official corporate account. This is the UK civil servant's main account, just after Dominic Cummings was revealed to have done it. And the tweet went, "Arrogant and offensive. Can you imagine having to work with these truth twisters?" Absolutely bona fide. It stayed up for ages. We were just all trying to check it out, work out, so whether this was authentic or not. But yeah, 8,500 retweets, 12,000 likes, 500 comments, all within a very short space of time. That's one way to give personality to your corporate main accounts. It did occur to me.
Great example. And so I guess, do you talking of examples, I think, because this is what people like to hear, do any of the panel want to share examples that they've seen on social media of good and bad practice? I know for myself, we're seeing a lot of this. There's a lot of discussion around equality and diversity, and there's a lot of companies not getting it right and being called out on social media for it. But coming back to kindness, I agree with Joe that actually I'm seeing a lot of people being very kind. There was an example of a couple of people who got into a spat, and certainly it was coming from one way. And that person then left social media. The next day, the person who'd actually been berated for what seemed no reason did say, look, I've spoken to the person has apologized, let's all move on, please let's not let this be a pile-on. And in fact, actually then a lot of people posting saying, oh, that's great, and actually, has anybody checked on this other person's mental health? Has everybody checked that they're okay? And I think if issues can be dealt with, and they can be dealt with quite quickly, whereas I think it's when they get out of control. And unfortunately, I think, and coming from a perspective, as a comms perspective, working on reputation, these problems often happen on weekends. And I don't know why that is. I don't know whether everybody saves up their Sauvignon Blanc till Friday, and then Friday night drinks it all and goes on social media. But definitely where we've seen issues is definitely around the weekends more than it is during the week, which is perhaps a good thing that people are doing their work. But I'd be keen to hear from, if anybody wants to raise their hand, I'm keen to hear from any of the other panel who've got examples of things good and bad on social media.
I think the bad is exactly as you've described, Melissa. It's the spats that we all see from time to time, and people engaging, other people then piling in. So that's not the attractive side of social media. I think the better side is people who clearly have got perhaps a bit more experience of social media. If that sort of situation arises, they just step back. People who are thinking about their audience, thinking about the environment we're working in. So just a bit more respectful, bringing those values to social media. So struggling to think of any recent specific examples of that. But as we have both said, I've certainly seen during lockdown rather changed behaviour, and I hope that will continue.
Yeah, and I guess we have a question here from Lydia. Who asks that due to working from home, more users accessing social media to keep in touch with clients, there's a lot more saturation of users posting. Can anyone give any tips on how to obviously stand out in the right way, not the wrong way? Or is it just that people should be posting more frequently, or is there a more strategic approach to that? But are you finding you're posting more? Are you finding you're spending more time on social media reading other people's posts?
I'm probably posting less because I sort of feel that this isn't a time to be pushing a corporate message. This is, as you say, it's a time for kindness. I'm posting more on Facebook than I have. I sort of pulled off Facebook for a while. I'm back on them now. And again, because it does feel like a very safe, very kind place. But for me, definitely, I'm pulling back on LinkedIn a lot and making my messages much more light and accessible so that people feel like I'm human. So that's the way I've gone during the crisis.
Yes. And I guess we're getting into our oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, ditto on Twitter. I think it's been much more social on Twitter. It's only recently, the last 2 or 3 weeks, I've focused more back on legal stories. Or there was a story I highlighted on last week about how we're going to have a 42% increase in divorces this year that a particular journalist had written. I thought, I absolutely want to dissect that, because that's totally wrong and irresponsible to be perpetuating that sort of myth. And lots of people engaged really positively with that. So it feels as though the conversation's moving on again, and people want to now talk about, go back to law reform. No fault divorce we're tweeting about today because that's in the Commons as we speak, for example. So I think that appetite is returning, but it will be gradual.
Yeah.
It's back around to adding value, isn't it? Being able to provide commentary which adds something to the discussion, to the debate, maybe to clarify something, or I think that's what we can do, and that's what people actually look to us to do as well. So again, a positive message.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess we're back to where we were at the beginning. And what I'm going to ask each of you to do is actually just give there's a lot of people, and a lot of those questions were really asking, what should we do? And we've talked about the fact that there hasn't been enough training, that there's policies there, but 40% of people don't actually even know what's in the policies. What we didn't ask was how up to date those policies are, because I think everybody should probably have a new policy since lockdown, since COVID-19, because of people using social media differently. So what would be your top tip if you had somebody coming into your room today to say, I'm just about to start on social media? What would your top tip be? And I think, Fiona, I'll start with you.
I think as a lawyer, I think the message has to be that we are here for our clients, and I would always focus on that. So the client is the centre. You're not the centre. The client is. And that would always be my focus.
Yeah. And Ed?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd urge someone who's at the start of this to have a look around and decide which accounts or people that they really like, and just try and, without being too creepy, just to copy and emulate the way in which they go about it. And I guess know what you're for. Some lawyers I know actually split their social media personality. There's one friend who is partner at a global firm, and also has very strong views on politics and on Brexit. And wants to be able to tweet those. So they've got their arbitration partners, a global firm account, and then they've got their more personal accounts, which is differentiated by pictures and so on. Neither's dishonest. He says on his description that he's a lawyer and what kind, but clearly feels like that's done enough and enabled him to do both without kind of getting into trouble.
And Sharon, can I come to you?
I think, choose your social media account of choice carefully. And I think also be authentic and recognise, it's a bit like what I would say to my kids, in fairness. What you put out there is literally going to stay out there. So you need to be very comfortable that you're happy to also defend that position should it come to that. But be authentic and obviously be kind.
And Kevin?
It's a difficult one. There's lots of things, but I think sort of self-moderation, sort of exercising that common sense that Sean talked about, which unfortunately isn't a constant, particularly after a glass of your Sauvignon Blanc. But I think just having that opportunity to moderate yourself, think about what other people might see from that, whether it's your mum or your senior partner.
Brilliant. And Joe?
Gosh, again, it's difficult. I mean, I think overall I'd say be yourself and decide how much of yourself you want to show on social media. So I think lots of clients, when they come to me, they feel like they know a bit of me already. They certainly know the type of lawyer I am. In fact, I'm not overly litigious. I focus on mediation, but they also know I'm a big Man United supporter, for example. That fortunately doesn't put lots of them off, and that I live in Brighton. So I think it's just being a bit individual, try to stand out, but draw appropriate boundaries around that as well.
And Sean, as a Leicester City fan, what do you have to say about this?
Well, I think that you approach in the same way, like a lot of these things, actually, if you think about it, like you would in real life, as they say. So you should probably avoid arguments about race, religion, certain aspects of sport, let's face it. That politics, probably, although politics is something a lot of people enjoy. If you do, fine. But there are obvious, and the Middle East as well. And if you avoid that lot, you'll be fine. If you don't want to avoid that lot, then you've got to be absolutely prepared for trouble.
Yeah. Well,
and also don't drink and tweet. That's an absolute rule.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. So what I would say is that you will be all sent a survey to fill in, a very quick survey. If you do have 2 minutes to fill it in, please do, because it will give us feedback, because we were hoping to actually run another panel very similar to this around social media, because there's so much to discuss. So please do fill that in. And the other thing is our social media during COVID-19, which actually does include almost all of the participants today in our webinar. So if you haven't got a copy of that, please let us know. We'll make sure we send that through to you. And I think the last thing I need to say is thank you very much, because I think the panelists here have given great insight into social media. They've given lots of tips and advice. We stayed away from talking about Donald Trump too much and Facebook, and I think we steered away from anything going too chaotic. So I'd like to say thank you very much to everybody for their time. I'm so delighted that I managed to manage the polls. And I'm just going to say on the questions, there's a lot of statements here from people saying, thank you very much. You've been absolutely awesome. Definitely want to hear from you again. You've all made great points. A lot of people saying absolutely, which I think means that they agree with you all. Some people having to head off and grab their kids, but that's a lot of thank yous and a lot of positives. So thank you everybody very, very much. And we'll be writing up a blog tomorrow which covers what we talked about today. So please do have a look at that. But take care, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.